The 8th of April, 1943, 27,000 feet above France. The sky looked harmlessly beautiful, pale blue and endless, the kind of morning that makes even a soldier pause. But inside his Fock, Wolf 190, Oberleutnant Ralph Hermchen, saw something below that made him chuckle through his oxygen mask, a sound that would echo in irony for the rest of his life. Beneath him, the massive American P-47 Thunderbolts clawed their way upward in tight, awkward formation. From above, they looked slow-bloated, almost comical. "These are our new opponents," Hermchen transmitted to his wingman, his tone dripping with amusement. "Flying milk bottles." Down below, Major Donald Blakesley, leading the 335th Fighter Squadron, could barely hear the banter crackling through his radio. His focus was on the climb rate needle, sluggish as usual. The oxygen hissed in his mask. He felt sweat gathering under his helmet. He knew the Germans were already up there waiting. In one cockpit, a rookie pilot named Jim Doyle, barely 21, muttered to himself, "This thing feels like a truck with wings." What he didn't know was that the truck would soon become the most feared machine in the European sky. But first, it would have to survive a baptism of fire that would nearly end the program before it began. And that story starts years before this mission, in a small New York design office filled with sketches, cigarette smoke, and a single crazy idea. In 1940, as Europe burned, the U.S. Army Air Corps sent Republic Aviation a desperate telegram. "We need altitude. We need power. We need something that can meet the Germans above the clouds." In a modest Long Island workshop, Alexander Kartively, a Georgian-born engineer who spoke in slow, accented English, looked at the specs and frowned. "They ask for a bird," he told his team, tapping the telegram with a pencil. "But they give us the heart of a bull." He knew what the military wanted: a nimble interceptor, lightweight, agile, another Spitfire. But Kartively had seen too many designs chase elegance at the cost of survival. He wanted something new, a heavyweight fighter that could climb, hit, and live. When the first sketches of the XP-47B were pinned on the wall, even his engineers hesitated. It was enormous. The supercharger tubing ran through the entire rear fuselage like veins through a body. One mechanic muttered, "Boss, this thing'll never fly." Kartively only smiled. "It will fly, and when it does, it will make thunder." By May 1941, the prototype was ready. The day it lifted off the runway, even the most skeptical engineers fell silent. It wasn't graceful, but it roared. The propeller wash-rattled hangar windows. The heavy landing gear groaned but held, and when it climbed into the thin air, Kartively whispered, "There, the sky met its match." The pilots nicknamed it, short for Juggernaut. The name stuck because it fit. They didn't know yet that this ungainly juggernaut would soon become the war's deadliest machine of survival. But for that, it first had to kill its own. The XP-47B's first real test came at altitude. At 27,000 feet, most engines gasped for oxygen. But the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp was a monster that refused to choke. Its turbo, supercharger fed by a maze of ducts, spat exhaust like a living dragon. Feels like a train trying to take off. One test pilot joked after landing, his flight suit still shaking from the vibrations. In those early months, few understood what they had. While German engineers obsessed over agility, the Americans had built a platform of endurance. At full power, the P-47 could fly higher, faster, and survive longer than any fighter before it. It didn't dance, it punched. In a training letter dated August 1942, test pilot Frank Fries wrote, "At altitude, she flies like a different aircraft. The controls go stiff, but the power keeps coming. You feel it in your spine, like flying with a storm inside you." That storm would become the defining character of the Thunderbolt. But in 1942, before it could become a legend, it became a killer of its own men. Between September 1942 and January 1943, the 56th Fighter Group lost 18 pilots and 41 aircraft. Not in combat, in training, runways littered with wrecks, broken landing gear, twisted props. The plane's enormous torque could roll it violently if pilots were careless on takeoff. Its weight made landings treacherous, and during dives it reached speeds so high the controls froze solid. Pilots called it the coffin spin. Major Hubert Hub Zemke, commanding officer of the 56th, once watched a trainee go into a dive and never come out. He grounded every pilot for 48 hours and rewrote their procedures by hand. "Respect the jug," he told them, "or it'll bury you faster than the Germans ever could." Mechanics began treating the P-47 like a living creature. They gave them names: Killer, Big Nurse, Lucky 13. In their diaries, they wrote about the aircraft like old friends with bad tempers. One crew chief scribbled, "It doesn't want to kill you, but it doesn't care if it does." Yet those who survived the learning curve began whispering something different. "This thing's got muscle, more than anything we've flown." One rookie, after a perfect flight, climbed out of the cockpit, wiped his forehead, and said, "She's not pretty, but she's the kind of ugly that wins wars." And he was right, because when the P-47 finally met the Luftwaffe, looks wouldn't matter. What mattered was who could take a hit and still fight back. The 8th of April, 1943, that first mission over France. The Luftwaffe circled above, graceful and confident, while 16 Thunderbolts of the 4th Fighter Group climbed below. Every American pilot that day felt like he'd drawn the short straw. The radio crackled. "They're laughing at us, Major." "Let them laugh," Blakesley replied. "Just keep climbing." Then the Germans dove. The sky erupted in chaos, tracers, cannon fire, smoke. A rookie named Ed Warren saw his wingman vanish in a flash of flame. He squeezed his trigger for the first time, felt the recoil rattle his bones, and watched a Focke-Wulf out of control. "God help me," he wrote later, "I didn't even aim. I just fired, and the air itself shook." By the end of the first month, 14 Thunderbolts were gone, for just 3 German kills. The British Spitfire pilots watching from the coast shook their heads. "Too heavy, too slow," one said. But American crews noticed something odd. Even the wrecks that limped home looked almost indestructible. Owen aircraft returned with 21 cannon holes and over 100 bullet strikes. The engine was leaking oil. The pilot's suit was soaked with hydraulic fluid, but the plane still landed. And when the canopy opened, the pilot laughed, blood in his teeth, eyes wild. "This thing," he shouted, "is built like a damn tank." They didn't know it yet, but that tank was about to prove something that would change air combat forever. Because 1 month later, one pilot would survive the impossible and show the world what the Thunderbolt could really endure. The 26th of June, 1943, skies over Lille, France. Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, age 22, was flying at the rear of a P-47 formation, returning from escort duty. He never saw the Germans coming. Out of the sun dove 16 Focke. Wolf 190s led by Wilhelm Galland, brother of the legendary ace Adolf Galland. The first cannon bursts tore through Johnson's plane, like thunderclaps. The canopy shattered, hydraulic fluid sprayed across his face. The cockpit filled with smoke. A shell fragment tore his nose, another cut his leg. The Thunderbolt bucked, groaned, and started to burn. Johnson tried to bail out, but the canopy was jammed. A 20mm round had exploded in the track. He was trapped inside a flying furnace at 27,000 feet. Most pilots would have given up. Johnson didn't. He shut off the smoke-filled oxygen line, steadied the stick, and whispered a prayer. Then he did something no manual could teach. He talked to the aircraft. "Come on, girl. Don't quit now." Somehow she didn't. Despite shattered hydraulics and a trembling engine, the P-47 kept flying. Minutes later, a German fighter reappeared, maybe Galland himself, and fired again. More shells ripped into the fuselage. Still, Johnson stayed in the air. When the German ran out of ammunition, he pulled alongside and stared at the impossible. Johnson, bloodied and shaking, raised a trembling hand. The German saluted, a small, stunned gesture, and peeled away. Johnson's plane made it back to England. The ground crew counted over 200 holes before they stopped. His canopy was welded shut from the explosion heat. The engine block had been torn apart, but the P-47 still rolled to a stop. When reporters asked how, Johnson just shrugged. "She wanted to come home," he said. That story spread like wildfire through Allied bases. Even German intelligence refused to believe it until multiple pilots confirmed it. That's when the Luftwaffe realized something chilling. They weren't fighting airplanes anymore. They were fighting machines built to survive hell itself. By mid-1943, pilots had stopped laughing about the P-47. They started counting. Counting seconds, counting rounds, counting kills. Because the Thunderbolt didn't just shoot, it erased. Each plane carried 850 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 4 in each wing, 425 rounds per G, 3,400 bullets ready to fly. When synchronized at 300 yards, their fire patterns merged into a sphere of annihilation, roughly 6 feet wide, big enough to swallow an enemy aircraft whole. On paper, it was math. In the air, it was horror. Lieutenant Francis "Gabby" Gabreski remembered his first kill vividly. When you hit with all 8, it doesn't look like shooting. It looks like disintegration. Each second of firing sent nearly 100 armor, piercing incendiary bullets, screaming through the sky at almost 3,000 feet per s-econd. A single 2-second burst could literally saw a Messerschmitt in half. German pilots learned that the hard way, not through intelligence briefings, but through the sudden flash that ended the flight of a comrade mid-sentence. In June and July 1943, those flying milk bottles turned into flying buzzsaws. The nickname Jug, once a joke, now stood for Juggernaut. And yet, the Thunderbolts' pilots weren't brash gunslingers. They were methodical, calm, engineers with wings. They treated each dogfight like a test of geometry and timing, not emotion. They knew their plane was not agile, so they used physics as a weapon. If the Luftwaffe turned tighter, the Americans dove faster. If the Germans sought elegance, the Americans brought momentum. The new rule of survival was simple. Don't fight the Thunderbolt in front of its guns. But a weapon that powerful still needed a doctrine, and that doctrine was born from a handful of pilots who figured out how to make gravity itself an ally. In the summer of 1943, Hub Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, gathered his men in a smoky English tent. He took a piece of chalk and drew 2 lines on a board, one looping, the other straight and steep. "This," he said, tapping the looping line, "is how they want to fight." He pointed to the steep dive, and this is how we'll win. That white chalk mark became the foundation of the boom, and zoom tactic, a revolution in aerial thinking. The idea was brutally simple. Don't turn, dive. Build altitude, strike fast, unleash all 8 guns in a burst, then climb out before the enemy can react. Captain Walker Bud Mahurin perfected it in combat. He described his first perfect attack as feeling like dropping the hammer of God. From 30,000 feet, the P-47 could dive past 550 miles per hour, faster than any German fighter could follow. In that dive, the Thunderbolt was invincible. The Germans tried to chase. Their wings began to shake, their engines coughed for air, and the Jug simply pulled away. Gabreski said it best. "We didn't fight dogfights anymore. We hunted. The sky became a chessboard, and we were the heavy pieces." Enemy radio chatter began changing tone. German pilots started calling out, "Achtung! Thunderbolts oben! Thunderbolts above!" It became a code word for danger. The hunter had become the hunted. Each kill reinforced a new truth. Air war was no longer about grace. It was about physics, firepower, and survival. And the P-47 was rewriting all 3. But the machine still had room to grow. Engineers back home were already designing an even more terrifying version, one whose sound alone could make soldiers dive for cover. By early 1944, a new sound haunted the German front lines, a low, thunderous growl that rolled across the sky. It wasn't artillery, it wasn't thunder. It was the P-47D with paddle, blade propellers, the thunderclap. Those new props, 13 feet in diameter, changed everything. The plane climbed faster, accelerated harder, and could chase enemies into thin air without losing breath. The blade's tips reached near, supersonic speed, creating a scream that terrified anyone below. One German infantryman later said, "You heard it before you saw it. That was the worst part. You knew death was coming, but you couldn't see from where." Pilots loved it. They said you could feel the difference. The torque pressed your spine into the seat as you pulled up from a dive. Major David Schilling called it the closest thing to divine intervention the Republic ever gave us. The upgrades didn't stop there. The P-47's range doubled with external drop tanks. It could now escort bombers deep into Germany. And once its fuel tanks were gone, it fought like a demon unleashed. For German pilots, this was the nightmare scenario. No safe altitude, no safe moment. In February 1944, Luftwaffe ace Heinz Nock described a battle over Hanover. They climbed with us. That was not supposed to happen. We laughed at them last year. Nobody laughs now. And as the Allies prepared for the greatest invasion in history, the P-47 was preparing for its greatest transformation, from Sky Guardian to executioner on the ground. The 6th of June, 1944, D-Day, over 500 P-47 Thunderbolts roared across the channel stacked from sea level to the edge of the stratosphere. Their engines thundered so loudly that troops below said it sounded like the earth itself was growling. German pilot Wolfgang Fischer remembered the moment he tried to break through that wall of sound. We thought we could climb over them. We were wrong. They were everywhere, at every altitude. You didn't fight them, you survived them. For the soldiers storming Normandy, the P-47 became a guardian angel. For the Germans, it was a demon of steel. Each one carried 8 heavy machine guns, 10 rockets, and up to 2,000 pounds of bombs. The ground shook with every pass. A German grenadier later said, "They came in so low you could see the pilot's goggles. Then everything turned to fire." From that day onward, the Luftwaffe never again owned the daylight. P-47s roamed freely, striking trains, convoys, tanks, anything that moved. The 9th Air Force's June 1944 report lists the impossible. 651 locomotives destroyed 3,847 trucks, 512 armored vehicles, and over 4,000 horse-drawn transports were turned to ash. Farmers in France learned to dive into ditches at the first sound of the Thunderbolts' roar. German units developed a name for it, Donnerschlag, thunderclap. They no longer saw it as a plane. They saw it as flying artillery. And as the P-51 Mustang took over long-range escort missions, the Thunderbolt found its new calling, to make the ground itself tremble. Behind every P-47 flying over Europe stood an army of workers who never left the ground. In Republic Aviation's factory in Farmingdale, Long Island, the assembly lines never slept. At their peak, they produced one Thunderbolt every 56 minutes. Rosy riveters, high school graduates, machinists from farms and factories, thousands worked shoulder to shoulder. They called it building a tank that flies. Each plane required 65,000 parts, 8 miles of wiring, and 2,000 pounds of aluminum. Yet by 1944, the rhythm was mechanical perfection. A rivet gun hiss, a shout, a bell, another jug rolling off the line. One factory worker, Edith Morley, later said in an interview, "Every bolt felt like a prayer. We knew someone's boy was going to sit behind that armor." Even more staggering was what came after the build. The training. By 1944, the U.S. trained 30,000 pilots a year. Each spent hundreds of hours learning how to shoot, climb, dive, and survive. At home, pilots practiced on towed targets, learning convergence fire by heart. By the time they reached Europe, they weren't rookies. They were technicians of destruction. Meanwhile, Germany's pilots were down to teenagers, many with less than 100 total hours of flight. They were brave, yes, but bravery alone doesn't reload your guns or refill your tanks. As one captured German officer put it, "We ran out of fuel before they ran out of pilots." The true secret weapon wasn't the plane. It was America's ability to replace everything and everyone faster than the enemy could destroy them. But by early 1945, even the Luftwaffe's best aces could see what was coming, an industrial avalanche that no amount of courage could stop. By 1945, the Luftwaffe was barely an air force, more a rumor of one. Fuel was scarce. Airfields lay in ruins. Many of the young men sent to fly had never fired a real gun in combat. a captured pilot, Klaus Brechtender, described his last mission. I saw them diving, 4 Thunderbolts, perfect formation. I turned, they fired. The sky turned silver with bullets. My plane split in 2. I remember falling through smoke. I wasn't even afraid, just done. That 12-second dogfight ended his squadron. He was the only survivor. For the Luftwaffe, Jabo fever became a real diagnosis, the psychological trauma of hearing Thunderbolts nearby. Ground troops froze, pilots vomited before missions, and radar operators abandoned stations at the sound of the P-47's distant thunder. They didn't fear the shape, they feared the sound. That low, thundering growl was death's calling card. In one interrogation after the war, a German ace named Joseph Priller, the same man who once mocked the Thunderbolt as a pregnant cow, said something that silenced the room. They didn't beat us with better pilots or prettier planes. They beat us with factories, fuel, and patience. We laughed in 1943. We were not laughing in 1944. After the war, at a 1985 reunion in Arizona, Adolf Galland, the former Luftwaffe general himself, admitted the truth. We thought the P-47 was a bomber pretending to be a fighter. We were wrong. The Americans understood war better than we did. They built an aircraft around power and survivability, not elegance. And they built 15,000 of them. He paused, his voice softer. When I first flew one after the war, I understood why we lost. Inside the U.S. Air Force Museum today, a restored P-47D Thunderbolt stands gleaming under the lights. Its olive skin still bears the scars of history, its 8 Browning guns silent but eternal. Beneath it, a small placard bears a quote from an anonymous German pilot. We laughed when we first saw them. Fat, ugly American fighters that couldn't turn or climb. We stopped laughing when we realized they didn't need to. They just pointed those guns, and you ceased to exist. And that's how the story ends. A plane born from panic, mocked for its size, cursed for its weight, became the avalanche that buried the Luftwaffe. In the end, the sound of 8 synchronized guns wrote the last sentence of the air war in Europe. It wasn't poetry, it wasn't elegance. It was mechanical, relentless, unstoppable thunder. The laughter that started over France in 1943 faded into silence by 1945, because by then, there were no German pilots left to laugh. The P-47 Thunderbolt wasn't beautiful. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't even liked. At first, but it did what war demands. It endured, it adapted, and it outlasted everything thrown at it. In its shadow, an entire philosophy of air power was rewritten, one that favored firepower over finesse, production over perfection, and survival over style. And as its 8 guns fell silent, one truth remained. Sometimes the loudest sound in history isn't the explosion itself, it's the silence that follows when the thunder stops. The P-47 Thunderbolt wasn't beautiful, it wasn't graceful, it wasn't even liked at first, but it did what war demands. It endured, it adapted, and it outlasted everything thrown at it. In its shadow, an entire philosophy of air power was rewritten, one that favored firepower over finesse, production over perfection, and survival over style. And as its 8 guns fell silent, one truth remained. Sometimes the loudest sound in history isn't the explosion itself. It's the silence that follows when the thunder stops.